further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Janice to the front to give us our Lent lecture on Mary, the Mother of Jesus. Dr. Janice, please.
Thank you all. It's lovely to be here with you. Mary, the Mother of Jesus. Well, we're much more familiar with Mary when we think of the beginning of Jesus' life rather than the end. But Mary was an eyewitness to the Easter story, and she would have gone through a whole range of emotions as she lived through that week. I'd like to explore her story, her character, and those emotions with you, and include before the Easter story to get a whole picture of who she was as she faced that week. And also to share with you some stories from my work with the Anglican Alliance, with local churches from around the Anglican Communion. I hope that these stories will help to help us to reflect on our lives as individuals and local churches here, and how we relate to those around us in our communities. So, from glory to agony, from childbearing through Jesus' childhood to the cross and beyond, Mary, the Mother of Jesus, is history's finest reminder that with God, nothing is impossible. So that was what Colleen Rees said in her book, Women of the Bible. And it seems like a good summary at the beginning of this talk about Mary, the Mother of Jesus. The illustrations on the slides are a mixture of an artist, which I really love, but I haven't managed to identify, so if anyone knows who it is, I'd really love to be able to credit it. And also some Ethiopian paintings. As you know, we lived in Ethiopia for 9 years. So, we'll go on. As I said, I work for the Anglican Alliance. I'm the Disaster Response and Resilience Manager, and I've led their work on relief activities for the last 5 years. So a lot of the examples will come from that work, but also more broadly from the work of the Anglican Alliance. The Anglican Alliance started after the Lambeth Conference in 2008, when Bishop Bill Godfrey from Peru said, "Where was the Anglican Communion?" They had a devastating earthquake in 2007, over 500 people were killed, well over 1,000 were injured, and that had the bishops thinking that actually we needed something as the Anglican Church that could respond and be there for churches at these difficult times. So after 2 years of regional consultations, the Anglican Alliance was set up and to connect and equip the worldwide Anglican family to work for a world free of poverty and injustice, and to raise the voices of the vulnerable and to safeguard creation. We're a small global organisation, and I've got colleagues in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in the Middle East, in Africa, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And the Secretariat in London has just 3 of us working part-time. So we're very small, but actually the organisation is any Anglican around the world, because it's your work, it's God's work, that we're there raising up, sharing the experience, sharing best practice. So the global team, they're part-timers usually as well, and they also have a role within the local church. So we're totally embedded in the local context. And that's our way of working, from the grassroots up, connecting and sharing. So we first hear of Mary at the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel comes to her. She's a young girl, pledged to be married to Joseph, and she's told she'll have a son. She's confused, troubled. How can this be, since I'm a virgin? She was probably only 14 years old, scarcely of childbearing age. She must have been thinking, what would Joseph say? Other people? And yet, a few verses later, she accepted her task faithfully. "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." What an amazing reaction. So my first story is about Martha, who was from a very poor family in East Africa. And she was living in a rural village, and she was offered the chance of a better life. Martha was only 16 when she travelled to the city for her promised job. On arrival, she found the reality to be very different. Once in this person's house, Martha was unable to connect with her family and was forced to work appallingly long hours every day without pay. And she often experienced sexual abuse. Martha's messenger was certainly not an angel. Fortunately, she eventually was able to get out of the house and talk to a neighbour, who took her to a nearby church shelter for vulnerable women. That was the start of Martha's long journey to recovery from the trauma she'd endured. And amazingly, her main request to churches is that they educate other young people not to be deceived by traffickers and to know the danger signs and how to get help. And my colleague June in Kenya is working with the church and an app developer to develop an app that is going to help girls from Kenya who are looking to work in Qatar. So through the connections in both places, they'll actually have what to look for in a job, how to check it really is what it says it is, and offering support and contacts in Qatar if things go wrong. And my colleagues have been doing a lot of work on human trafficking and modern day slavery, having consultations around the world. And around the world, human trafficking and modern slavery attract many people, but churches are responding. Like Martha's church, it can be by caring and protecting those who've been trafficked. And as Martha says, preventing people from being trafficked or enslaved by educating other young people to not be deceived by traffickers and to know the danger signs and how to get help. But also a really important thing that churches are doing is just helping young people to have livelihoods and the families not to be so poor that they are so desperate that they will try anything to try and make money and to have a future. Interesting, as a former child slave said, if every church spoke about human trafficking for 2 minutes every month, it would change the world. Because it's going on here, it's not just something over there, whether it's nail bars, car washes, agricultural work, it's there. I mean, and trafficking can have many forms: forced labour, sex trafficking, domestic servitude, like we heard of from Martha, forced labour at sea, either fishing and seafaring, child trafficking, cyber sex trafficking, forced marriage, and even one that's coming to light more recently is organ trafficking. People being kidnapped and then finding that they've been put to sleep and had kidneys taken and things like that. So we heard about Mary as a young, vulnerable girl, and yet when we come to the Magnificat, when she visits Elizabeth, we see another side to her. In Mary's song, we see her again, faithful, praising God, humble, but actively accepting her God-given task that will have an impact from generation to generation. So in the Magnificat, we see Mary's holiness, her faithfulness, but also, is this her song of high revolt, as Fred Kahn saw it? Is she seeing the injustice in the world and knowing that God wants a better world? Is she singing of God's kingdom, a world without injustice? For instance, in verses 52 and 53, He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but sent the rich away empty. So here's a story that we should lament about. The Vale Dam collapse in Brumadinho in Brazil in January this year. This was an injustice that would have grieved God, as it did the church and others who work with indigenous people in Brazil. The church is lamenting, as you can see from this post that my colleague Paolo did, a real cry from the heart about the devastation, both to the environment and to the livelihoods of the people living there. But they're also working to improve things. So the church and others have been advocating to the mining companies and their governments for change, for justice for the indigenous people. Because the same mining companies that abide by strict rules in countries with people who really fight for them don't keep to those same standards in developing countries like Brazil, the Philippines. So if these accidents happen, the safety measures aren't there. But the indigenous people around the mine, they live off the forest, they live off the rivers that have been destroyed and polluted by the mining. But the amazing thing about the churches, the Anglican Church, is that we have access to power as well. So we reach right down to the grassroots and the vulnerable, but up to those in power as well. So when Paolo was in London, I was able to introduce him to the ethical investments team at the Church of England, and he was able to bring these stories, the reality for these people, to that team. And they're now having meetings with the mining companies, and they will be able to advocate for safety and protection, both for people, indigenous people, and the environment. So, I mean, when we see something like that, we can cry out at the injustice that the indigenous people's voices have not been heard by the government or the mining companies, but also we can act. And I mean, that's where staying as shareholders in some of these companies, which I know is what the Church of England believes in, they're in a position then to advocate for change. Now, we all know the nativity story, Mary giving birth to her firstborn son, wrapping him in cloth and placing him in a manger, as there was no room available for them, and the shepherds came. But if you look at that story, all the reports are in the third person. She doesn't say anything. But we hear of her as contemplative, observing, noticing, being. So as Luke says, but Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. Just like Mary was contemplative, observing, listening, being, these ways of being are at the heart of the work of communities in disaster preparedness and community development. This example is from a field visit on a recent Pastors of disaster preparedness training that I was leading a few weeks ago in Grenada. And the participants there are practicing tools to help communities look with new eyes and listen to new voices and to be. We spent an afternoon in the community of Telescope that had suffered considerable erosion of the coastline due to climate change, with loss of pasture and no longer able to plant food gardens. And you can see here, this was how they remembered it. Oops, sorry. How they remembered it on the left. So, back in 1995. And talking with them and having them reflect on what was happening, they told us what had been going on. And we knew of the erosion and that they no longer could grow those gardens. But there were some surprises as well. So actually they said, well actually the fishing is much better than it used to be. And they've got seaweed farms, which is actually a high value crop. So just by talking to us, and that's really what the church can do, be the catalyst for conversations, they can see that they've actually God's given them some resources that they didn't expect and they didn't know. And that in this way, through our disaster preparedness and community development work, we help communities to see the resources, the talents, the skills that they have that they can use for their communities. From the presentation of Jesus at the temple, from the story of Simeon, we learn that Jesus' family were poor, but still faithful in the laws and customs of their people, taking Jesus to the temple. Again, the reporting is very detached when the parents of the child, and then the child's father and mother, and then Luke suddenly brings this story, remote story, into sharp focus. And we're told that Simeon blessed them and spoke to Mary, his mother, directly, predicting great things for Jesus, but also a sword shall pierce your own soul too, foretelling the agony of Holy Week. I've learned that the church has the potential, as part of communities, listening, observing, being, to be able to be that voice of warning, foretelling the agony. We had an early warning of drought that affected large parts of southern Africa in 2015, and we're able to share that through our networks. So, and also, ahead of conflict, the church is often aware and able to raise concerns, but also to act and bring reconciliation. Sadly, here in the UK, I don't think the church have been listening and observing closely enough and sharing their concerns at the disenfranchisement that people were feeling ahead of the Brexit referendum. Everyone was surprised that people were so disaffected. We need to listen to our communities, our context, so that we can raise up those concerns that go unheard, the people who feel their voices are never heard. The flight to Egypt. Only Mary has this, but Matthew has this. Joseph is warned by an angel to escape and seek refuge in Egypt. That's quite a journey, a long way, whichever way you go. What did Mary feel, having to flee, travel such a long way with her young son? Like Joseph, many parents are forced to flee with their families. This was Bassam and Samar, who I met in Amman in Jordan. They'd had to flee their homes in Iraq many times. Back in 2003, they were living, working peacefully, successfully in Mosul. But then his brother was killed by fanatic Muslims because under Saddam Hussein, the Christians had a degree of protection. After that, things were more precarious for them, and they moved to a village in a Nineveh Valley where other Christians were living. Then, when ISIS came to strength in 2014, they were forced to flee. They drove up to Erbil in the Kurdish region in northern Iraq, and they were living in a tent. You can see there, just one toilet. The tent was in the church grounds of a church shrine. 200 people were sheltering there. Just one toilet, 50 degrees heat. Life was very difficult, without enough to eat, a lot of health issues, but they'd been welcomed and given protection in that shrine. But eventually, all their money had run out. They were really struggling, so they fled to Jordan, which is where I met them, living in 2 rooms and really surviving with help from family overseas and the local Anglican Church. They were Christians, so they wouldn't feel safe in the refugee camps, where they would get support, housing, education, healthcare for their children. I visited the camps, and compared to how they were living, it was very comfortable, but they just wouldn't have been safe. They really appreciate that the Jordanian government, I think they host 1 million refugees, and they've got a population of 5 million. I mean, their hospitality is just amazing. But they just wish they could work to provide for their families, give them a future, because only Adam, the oldest, is in school, and that's with support from one of the other churches that he's got some help to get to school. Later in Luke, we hear about Jesus as a 12-year-old boy at the temple, who stayed there after his parents had left. Verse 46 tells us that after 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers and listening to them and asking questions. Mary had lost her son, and there she was questioning, "How can you treat us like this? Your father and I have anxiously been searching for you." But he'd only been lost for 3 days. When people flee conflict, it's easy to get separated from a family member, particularly if they're elderly or have a disability. Imagine what that feels like, when you've left your home and everything that's familiar, and then the guilt of having lost a child or an elderly parent on the way, or having had to leave the parent behind. This was one of the issues that came up quite a lot when I visited a refugee camp in Burundi and Zambia, where with the local church, we were developing a toolkit for faith leaders to engage with people with disabilities and their families. Well, parents of albino children fear losing their children daily. In East and Central Africa, albino children are thought to have special powers. They're at a risk of being taken for witchcraft. I met this family in Kinama refugee camp when I was visiting in Burundi, and we were really working to see how the faith leaders could actually change attitudes, because actually it's about challenging those negative attitudes and helping people to see that everyone, whether they've got a disability or not, have got gifts to share as well as needs to be met. And really the church is in a very good position to challenge these negative beliefs, because they're trusted, they have access to people, and they can, for something like this, they can refer back to the Bible or the Quran, and they all speak out about these sort of issues. Jesus' first miracle, at the wedding at Cana, comes at Mary's prompt. As we've seen before, Mary notices that the wine is finished, speaks to Jesus. She doesn't react when he pushes back. She simply says to the servants, "Do what he tells you." Again, as we see Mary, an example of faithfulness, seeing what needs doing, acting quietly, not looking for attention. Here is an example from DR Congo, when the church reached out to communities with messaging about Ebola prevention, as the deadly virus was taking hold in the eastern region that's already struggling with armed conflict and the resulting poverty. As in Western Africa, which had the huge Ebola epidemic, there was a lack of trust in the government and outside agencies that were passing on the prevention messages. In addition, the conflict was really limiting access that international agencies had. But the church was strong in the region, and it's part of the community. So they were able to travel around the region, sharing prevention messages to community leaders, as well as in health centres and schools. And you can see here, at the schools, they set up these hand washing centres. So they were modelling and showing people what to do, and preaching about it, and just completely reinforcing the messages so that they could be heard. So being trusted, they also shared about safe, dignified burials and made sure that these were carried out, that contacts of infected people came forward for vaccinations and monitoring. The epidemic, sadly, is still ongoing, but the church is still there, supporting the response. The real turning point for the epidemic in West Africa was when the faith leaders started to be engaged by the military and the health authorities, and they were promoting these safe, dignified burials, because the practice there is the dead, is that you wash the body, and it's very sort of important traditional ways of treating a dead body, which of course then infected the women who then brought it home. So by having ways of doing the burials that were safe but still gave that cultural importance and sensitivity, that was a turning point for the epidemic there. At the start of the Holy Week, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, being hailed as King. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. Mary is not mentioned, but in this Ethiopian picture, she's looking on, part of the crowd. What was she thinking? Was she thinking back that this was what the angel had foretold at the Annunciation? Because she was told, "You'll conceive and give birth to a son, and call him Jesus. He'll be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." A time of celebration, but yet again, Mary is observing, being unnoticed. So Mary was looking on unnoticed, and so it is for many people in our communities, particularly women, the elderly, people with disabilities. The church needs to observe, listen, and reach out and include. Here I'm sharing about the work of SUDRA, the South Sudanese Development and Relief Agency of the Episcopal Church of South Sudan. Throughout the latest conflict in South Sudan, SUDRA has been working faithfully and tirelessly to give support to the most needy and responding to the evolving situation, working with others and filling the gaps, reaching those in the community that others are overlooking. So this is from Bentiu in the north of South Sudan, where famine was declared early in 2017 as a result of the drought that was adding to the challenges of the conflict. That northern area is remote, hard to reach, hard to bring in food relief, but small traders were getting some supplies from Sudan in the north. So SUDRA changed its response and started providing cash to the most vulnerable families. Thus, they had access to the food much more quickly than trying to get trucks of food that were getting hijacked on the road. But also they were able to choose what they were needed most: an egg for a sick child, fresh vegetables, rather than just beans or maize that would be in the relief rations. SUDRA reported that the cash distributions has stabilised or increased food consumption among vulnerable, pregnant and breastfeeding women, young children, people with disabilities, and elderly households. The church was also, at the same time, working to challenge the leaders to work for the people, not their own self-interest, echoing Mary's vision of God's kingdom in the Magnificat. As I said before, he has brought down the rulers from their thrones and lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. The Last Supper, like many significant times in Jesus' life, Mary is not there or not mentioned. So often women are not there for important events or able to get their perspective heard on the situation. One place that they're often missing and where they make a crucial difference is in conflict situations. In 2000, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 recognises war impacts women differently and stressed the need to increase women's participation in peace talks. But from 1992 to 2011, only 9% of negotiators at peace tables were women. And yet, when women are included in the peace process, there's a 20% increase in the probability of an agreement lasting at least 2 years, and there's a 35% increase in the probability that the agreement will last 15 years. So they just bring different perspective. They're not worried about self-interest. They bring the issues of the elderly, of the children, of the reality of daily life. As we move on through Holy Week, Jesus was arrested and he was mocked and beaten. Was Mary nearby? Imagine that as a mother. How does it feel seeing your son being tormented and tortured? Little did she know that worse was to come. But was it the beginning of the prophecy Simeon gave her at the temple when Jesus was a child, after he blessed Joseph and her, that a sword shall pierce your own soul too? After the crowd had insisted that Pilate crucify Jesus, the soldiers led him away. And Luke says, a large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed. Mary's pictured here as one of these women. Again, what was it like for her to see her son going to his death? She was powerless, looking on. It must really have felt as though Simeon's prophecy was being fulfilled. But sometimes it's not just women, it's all of us who feel powerless. So we lament with those who suffer. Sometimes situations can be distressing, overwhelming. There is a time that all we can do is cry out in prayer for the situation and for the people involved in them. For instance, the cyclone that hit Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. We saw it on the news, the inland lake, the reports of rescuers prioritising women and children trapped in trees and then going back next day for the men and the boys, only to find them gone, washed or swept away. In the early days of an emergency, we can cry out in prayer, while those locally are doing what they probably can, including the church. After the rescue, there's more scope for the church to play a role through the relief and recovery stages of an emergency. At the Anglican Alliance, we reach out to the local church leaders and we share about the situation for prayer, and we also work with them on their response. So we're working with the leaders in all three of those countries. We've had conversations and conference calls so that they can speak to partners around the world. At the cross, Mary is grieving. It really is happening. Her son is dying. But Jesus has a last word for her. He gives her a new family, someone to take care of her. The disciple he loved and trusted, he asked him to care for her. How must she have felt? She's losing her son, but at this dark moment, he's thinking of her. He's giving her a new family. Amid her grief, there's also confusion at what Jesus is saying and doing for her. Relief that she won't be alone, but also surprise when at other times she's just seemed to be unimportant to him. Is there something there for us to learn, that even when things are difficult, possibly overwhelming, God remembers us, is with us, cares for us deeply? I think this is something for us to hold on to and share with others at dark times. Whether it's within our families or people we work with, in our community, there's always times when there's someone who we can reach out to and be there for. So, the dark times, I've already talked about lamenting, but we can be there for people, giving them hope, reminding that God is there with them despite everything that's happening. And I see this around the world after an emergency, that the church is there with people in the trauma, often before others even arrive, giving hope through prayer, but also emotional and spiritual support. Because the church is there for the long haul, like God. He is with us forever. In the same way, the local church is there in the community before, during and after a disaster. Often they're unseen, working quietly, well after the spotlight of the media has moved on, helping people recover so they can rebuild their lives, so that they can live life in all its fullness, as John tells us, as Jesus really intends us all to do. At his death, we're told that all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Mary must have been among the women, but is unreported. So artists over the years have portrayed Mary in varied ways. Here, as Simeon said all those years before, a sword shall pierce your own soul too. The agony of your son dying, piercing her soul. I think we can all relate to that. The disbelief, the agony. And then there are more familiar images of Mary in the Easter story. Mary after Jesus has died, showing a range of emotions, the care there gently as she's getting Jesus down from the cross, or the quiet moment with her son to hold him. What were her feelings? What were her emotions? On the left there, as she had to share him, even at this time, and all she wanted was to hold him. Or as the other picture suggests, maybe disbelief, just looking at him, stunned with the others, maybe feeling supported by having others around her. In the same way, after an emergency, people react in different ways to the same situations. So just as being with people here is depicted differently. In the early days of a disaster, generally there's great togetherness and support. The church can play a key role in maintaining that community cohesion bringing people together, giving them space to talk about what's happened, to share their story. Certainly that was a key role that Bishop, I can't remember his name, who covered Grenfell Tower fire, was saying that was what people really valued. The clergy just being out there and walking, listening, just having time for people to just pour out the horror of what they've been through. Whether it was the firemen and women, whether it was the people who'd been in flats, or people in surrounding flats who'd watched in horror. The church was there, listening and being. And here we've got famous Michelangelo's Pieta and a more modern version. Was that a quiet moment for her to say goodbye? And again, that's something after an emergency, the care for others, the reaching out, but the need to find the body of a loved one to say goodbye. And interesting, that whole, because death is so much closer and part of life in Ethiopia, I was not surprised to learn that all the families of those who died were given a kilo of soil from the earth where the plane crash happened last month, so that they had something tangible, that they could have a memorial service even though they hadn't got a body. Because actually that whole saying goodbye and grieving is a really important process, and the church can be the ones that bring that reality. And then we move on to the tomb. And Mary must have been among the women that were at the tomb. It's unreported. But we've learned from her story that she was strong, faithful, prayerful, believing. So we might think from the fact that she's not mentioned that she was insignificant, powerless, unimportant. I don't believe that was so. So I'd like to share a story of women who were there in the pain of their communities. Another story from South Sudan, but from earlier in the conflict. And at the time I was hosting regular conference calls with the Emergency Crisis Committee of the Episcopal Church for partners to be able to hear about the situation, for prayer and solidarity. And this was a call in August 2016, when the conflict had spread from the traditional areas where it has been over the decades and where it had been for the first 3 years of the war. And Mama Harriet here, who's the Mothers Union provincial coordinator, shared about the situation, but her voice particularly about the sexual and gender-based violence brought the reality of the conflict home. Having her on the call brought a different perspective, the women's perspective, different insights. And it was from people who were right in the middle of it. They were running with the people to the bush, hiding as the soldiers raided the villages. They weren't in an office in a town somewhere. So, and she really shared that whole confusion and panic, and that conversation had a powerful impact on me and others. And we weren't able to make a difference for those women, though I'm sure that the local Mothers Union members did. They were there offering comfort and support. But through conversations with the Episcopal Church's Justice, Peace and Reconciliation Committee, Christian Aid, and then later Lambeth Palace Reconciliation Team, and Tear Fund, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the UK Army Chaplains Department, they worked with the church to try and challenge, they supported the church as they worked to challenge the culture that led to that violence against women and girls by men in uniform. They've been working with the army chaplains and the Ministry of Defence in South Sudan on strengthening the role of army chaplains to hold the military to account on the protection of civilians. The Church, through its network, is in a position to work for change, but this only happened thanks to the women's voices. From glory to agony, from childbearing through Jesus' childhood to the cross and beyond, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is history's finest reminder that with God, nothing is impossible. I hope that the images of Mary and the stories from around the communion will help us to reflect on our lives as individuals and as the local church, and to think about how we can live our lives as God's children, listening, noticing, being with our communities. Following Mary's example, what can we do here, now, with people in our lives, our communities, to help bring that wonderful vision of God's kingdom a bit closer? I think of all the amazing work that I hear about around the Anglican Communion as points of light, points of hope, amidst what can be devastating and depressing situations. But at the same time, we can be points of light in our communities, and particularly the local church. So how can we be like Mary, listening, noticing, being, acting quietly, connecting with others to respond to what we see, speaking out against injustice and conflict and the exploitation of creation, so that we can have the world that God wants. As our common vision says, we're called to be Christ-like, contemplative, compassionate, courageous. Well, I think Mary has been an amazing role model for us in some ways that we can live this out. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janice, for that very powerful talk, and it's wonderful to see about applied Christianity, Christianity in the world. It's wonderful to see. We now have a question and answer session, so if you do have a question for Janice, please put up your hand. Maybe we'd like to ask Janice a question. Yeah, Sharon.
It's not a question, it's an observation, and for those that know me, I do what I'm going to. It just seems that the women do the work.
I don't get hurt. Yeah, they certainly are a powerhouse.
One man and lots of women.
Anybody want to defend the men?
Janice, I know you and Andrew worked a lot in Ethiopia and then came back here, and it seemed to be quite a huge shock to Andrew, the disjunct between the two. I was just wondering if it was the same for you, and whether you feel that the last 8-10 years has, well, how you reflect on it really, and how you cope with the difference between life in Ethiopia and life in a very different culture like ours.
You're right, Julie, yes. Huge change. And probably the biggest shock, the hardest thing, was in Ethiopia. You're living in a country of faith, whether people are Christian or Muslim. Faith is at their core. So you can have conversations about faith on the bus to work or anyway. I mean, you can pay the electricity, and you can have a conversation. Oh, Anglican Church, what's that? And you have a conversation, and you're never having to apologise for having faith. So coming back here, where it feels like even people of faith, it's hidden. So that was a big thing. I think I realised that I was settling back and taking things for granted when I didn't give thanks for having electricity and water and internet in a day. I mean, you could easily not have all three of those for large parts of the day out there, and it probably took me 9 months before that felt normal. Life is very different, but I think there's still a lot of faith and faithful people here, but much more under the radar, and I think we need to be bolder. I think people are doing amazing things as churches and as individuals. I think we've just got to own it and claim it and say, yeah, we're part of the structure of our country and our society, and we're important, and we can make a huge difference. And there's a lot going on. And I don't know what's going on here, but I know there will be a lot going on, whether it's with old people, with toddlers, with people living on their own, but I think we're very good at hiding our light under a bushel.
Any other questions?
You mentioned that some of the work that you've done with your husband overseas, but also the conference calls when you hear of lots of other things happening. I wonder, are you seeing, you've given specific examples of the impact that women are having in their local communities. Are you seeing that that is increasing, or are women still very much repressed and in the minority, and it's only the very rare occasion where you hear of things happening?
I don't know, I think the women are doing it, and whether they're being heard and whether they're having the impact they could have. And so particularly that one about being involved in peace talks and conflict resolution is quite staggering. But I think we know from our society that when women are involved, the conversation is different, and the reports that when boards have a gender balance, it's just a much more collaborative, it's much more inclusive, people think about other people, it's not about, it's just a different dynamic, just because that's how we are as nurturing and caring, it's in our DNA. So have I answered the question? Or not quite. I mean, certainly there are plenty of societies where it's very difficult for women, but I think they usually find a way to do things, but there's more, and they could thrive so much more, and some hugely amazing work, particularly by the Mothers Union overseas. But no, I hadn't realised that I've got a gender imbalance there. So I mean, I'll speak for Joseph Bilal, who was the person on the Justice, Peace and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, that wasn't actually his full-time role. He was the manager of the new university that was being set up in Juba in South Sudan. But actually he'd been on that call, and he was visiting in the UK, and he came with us to the Foreign Office, and he followed up because he had the contacts and the passion, and he was the one that got all this work with the army chaplains going. So, yeah, having the passion, but also, I mean, the church does have access, and I think we have to use that and to our advantage for advocacy and things.
Any other questions?
If anything, Janice, about Jesus' relationship with Mary, and it's the bit about how that you said that sometimes Mary seems to be unimportant to Jesus, you know, and we see that perhaps at Cana in Galilee when he refers to her as woman. And I just wondered whether, we can't know the answer to this, but if it had been me, I'd have been really cross with him, and I'd wanted to slap him and tell him that he'd so really,
Yes.
and it just makes you wonder, you know, because Mary is this very sort of enigmatic figure, being really strong in some ways as the Magnificat, and yet really very much in the background, just the underdog doing what women do. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about that.
Well, yeah, interesting. There was another slide that got cut because it was about where Mary and her brothers, I think, and his brothers were trying to get to him. And he said, oh no. Yeah. So, who is my mother? Yeah. So, it's definitely something that I felt came out through looking at her story, that she's, at times she does seem to be insignificant for him, which I think is why that last bit seems so poignant and must have really confused her, that suddenly he's actually noticing her. And I think, that whole thing that even at dark times that God is with us is a really important thing to hold on to.
I was also thinking, in thinking about the position of women in the church, that Mary always seems to be put in the position of the ideal woman, an unattainable ideal woman to me. That's what you should aim for, girls, not the Mary Magdalenes. So I'm always a bit conflicted when I see images of Mary as to what it means for me.
Yes, and I think probably I've brought some, probably the non-traditional images of Mary, because just trying to bring out some of the complexities and bring her out as a person with feelings, and rather than that idealised woman. But she would have been, I would have thought, be feeling quite put out at some of the times she was treated by Jesus.
Any more questions? No? Well, we do have a little gift for you here, Janice, so just want to say thank you for giving up your time to come and speak to us. We really enjoyed your talk, so thank you very much.
Thank you.